All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Hawk's Podcast. I'm Hawk. I'm your host. I'm recording this on Sunday, April 27th. Today, we're going to talk about several things that are related to one another. We are going to talk about El Salvador. We are going to talk about President Nayib Bukele, the current president of El Salvador. We're going to talk about MS-13, and we are going to talk about CECOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, the prison that we've been hearing so much about inside El Salvador, and that the United States sent about 235 immigrant deportees to on March 15th. First, we're going to start with the State Department's travel advisory for El Salvador. Currently, exercise normal precautions, Americans traveling to El Salvador. Gang activity has decreased over the last 3 years. This has caused a drop in violent crimes and murders. We're going to talk about how that came to be today. U.S. government employees working in El Salvador are allowed to travel throughout the country during daylight hours. Okay, sounds pretty safe. U.S. government employees are prohibited from using public buses, frequently the target of attacks of gangs. Since March of 2022, there's been what's called a state of exception in El Salvador. I think we would understand that to be a state of emergency. It allows local authorities to arrest anyone who they think is involved in gang activity. It suspends several constitutional rights. This includes the right to normal protections of criminal procedure, like the right for a speedy or a fair trial. Tens of thousands of people are currently in prison under the state of exception. Several U.S. and other foreign citizens have been detained under the state of exception. Okay, the state of exception is still in place. If you decide to travel in El Salvador, minimize travel outside of major cities at night. El Salvador has a zero tolerance for driving under the influence of alcohol. You can be detained for having any level of alcohol while driving. Do not drink and drive. When possible, travel in pairs or groups. Okie doke. Do not hitchhike. Can you imagine traveling to El Salvador and thinking it would be a good idea to hitchhike? Do not physically resist any robbery attempt. Stay alert when visiting banks or ATMs. Use caution when swimming near El Salvador's beaches. No reason given. Okay, so I read a whole ton of stuff for this episode, a lot of it extremely interesting. We're going to start talking about El Salvador itself before we get into the other topic areas. The history of how El Salvador came to be and the history of this region. I read a whole bunch about that today, and it was pretty fascinating, to be honest with you. There have been humans inhabiting this area of what is now Central America and El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala for thousands of years. It's referred to as the Mesoamerican nations. Historically, were controlled by the Mayans, the Cuscatlecs. Okay, archaeology. Then the Olmec presence around the first millennium BC, so like 3,000 years ago, and before them were the Mayans. The region was conquered by Spain at the beginning of the the beginning of the 16th century, so early 1500s. And it was fascinating to read about a lot of this stuff. I mean, a lot of the colonialism stuff that happened there with Spaniards sounds remarkably similar to things that happened in what became the United States of America. Then El Salvador became a sovereign state around 1841, and with more or less the same borders that it has today. And from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, El Salvador endured chronic political and economic instability characterized by coups, revolts, and a succession of authoritarian rulers. All of this civil unrest and persistent socioeconomic inequality culminated in a Salvadoran civil war from 1979 to 1992, so pretty recent history, fought between a military-led government backed by the United States and a coalition of left-wing guerrilla groups. During the Civil War and afterwards, large numbers of Salvadorans emigrated to the United States. From 1980 through 2008, nearly 1 million Salvadorans emigrated to the United States, and by 2008, they were the sixth largest immigrant group in the United States. Their economy is dominated by agriculture, indigenous cacao crops in the 16th century, and then boomed into the farming of the indigo plant in the 19th century, which was used for dyes. You just think the color indigo. Then it shifted to coffee, which by the early 20th century accounted for 90% of export earnings. They've since reduced their dependence on coffee and embarked on diversifying its economy by opening up trade and financial links and expanding the manufacturing sector. The colon, the currency of El Salvador since 1892, was replaced by the United States dollar in 2001. So, yeah, there you go. It is a country of currently about a population of about 6 million people. And here's some cool stuff that I found. During the Pleistocene, Pleistocene is a prehistoric time period, was inhabited by the giant ground sloth, the rhinoceros-like Mixtoxodon, a giant llama, and the horse. So horses indigenous to that region. El Salvador has likely been occupied by humans since the Paleo-Indian period based on fluted stone points, think arrowheads, found in western El Salvador. There are active volcanoes in the area, and there have been times when volcanoes have gone off and wiped out entire cities and towns. Let's see. Spaniards arrived in 1522, but by 1521, the indigenous population of the region had been drastically reduced by a smallpox epidemic that was spreading throughout the territory. The first known visit by Spaniards to what is now Salvadoran territory was made by Admiral Andres Nino, who led an expedition to Central America in 1522, shortly after the smallpox thing. So the Spaniards went there looking for gold and jewels, and they found that the region did not have gold and jewels. But then they soon discovered the richness of the volcanic soil, and so agriculture took hold. Then there was a Spanish conquistador named Pedro de Alvarado, who had some difficulty with the locals. They fought back, and he had to retreat a bunch of times. The indigenous populations stole a bunch of Spanish weaponry. They wounded him in battles, and he apparently sent Mexican messengers to demand that the warriors of the region return the stolen weapons and surrender to the Spanish king. The local warriors responded with the famous response, "If you want your weapons, come get them." And so eventually Alvarado chickened out. And in 1526, the Spanish founded the garrison town of San Miguel in northern Managua. But through surprise attacks and overwhelming numbers, the local indigenous population were able to drive the Spanish out of San Miguel, and they destroyed the garrison. Eventually, the Spaniards won. There was a period of colonialism for almost 300 years, from 1525 to 1821. But they got their independence around 1821, and El Salvador became declared its independence and became its own sovereign nation in January of 1841. This was when they were still basing their economy on coffee, and surprise, surprise, you'll be shocked to learn that the enormous profits that coffee yielded served as an impetus for the concentration of land into the hands of an oligarchy of just a few very wealthy families. Throughout the last half of the 19th century, a succession of presidents from the ranks of the Salvadoran oligarchy, nominally both conservative and liberal. I mean, ideology didn't really matter. They were ruled by people with money. Generally agreed on that coffee was their predominant crop. The passage of anti-vagrancy laws to ensure that displaced campesinos and other rural residents provided sufficient labor for the coffee plantations, and they suppressed rural discontent. And this is before 1912. In 1912, the National Guard was created as a rural police force. So even back then, it's like the police were being created in other countries to protect assets and wealth, not the people who lived there. That takes us to the 20th century, beginning and again, a succession of essentially dictators. This period I found to be pretty fascinating. Beginning in January 1932, there was a brutal suppression of a rural revolt known as La Matanza. In the unstable political climate of the previous few years, social activist and revolutionary leader Farabundo Martí helped found the Communist Party of Central America and led a communist alternative whose goal was to help poor and underprivileged Salvadorans through the use of Marxist-Leninist ideology. So it's like, growing up in the 80s, when Reagan was president, when I was in elementary and middle school, I remember hearing about like communism in Central America. And Reagan had his whole thing with Nicaragua and the Sandinistas, and it was part of the Oliver North and trading weapons to Iran and all of this stuff. I just remember when I was a kid thinking that the entirety of Central America was like a hotbed of communism. On January 22nd, 1932, thousands of poorly armed peasants in the western part of El Salvador revolted against the government and then President General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez. The rebellion occurred amid widespread unrest over suppression of democratic political freedoms following the cancellation of the results of a 1932 election. You spotting any parallels, guys? Oh, God. Are we going to be saved by hordes of poorly armed peasants? I mean, doubtful, because we have more guns than people in the United States. The rebels were led by Feliciano Ama and Farabundo Martí and were largely composed of indigenous people and communists. So it killed a whole bunch of people. And then that brings us up a few years later to the Salvadoran Civil War. The United States supported and financed the creation of a junta to change the political environment and stop the spread of a leftist communist insurrection. Cool. It killed tens of thousands of people. An unknown number of people disappeared during the conflict, and the UN reports that more than 75,000 people were killed. But in October 2017, they put a former president in prison after he and his sons had illegally enriched themselves. In 2018, another former president was sentenced to 10 years in prison after he pleaded guilty to diverting more than $300 million in state funds to his own businesses. I'm reading through this stuff and I'm like, gosh, that sounds familiar. So then we get to our current president, President Bukele. He was elected in 2019, and he had been kicked out of one political party. So he'd been a mayor a couple times for some cities in El Salvador. And so he just started a new political party, the Party of New Ideas, Nuevas Ideas. And he won. His party and its allies won a supermajority in the parliament. And along with him, that permitted them for uncontested decisions at the legislative level. The supermajority that President Bukele has permits him to appoint judiciary members and pass laws with little to no opposition, for instance, to remove presidential term limits. Putin. Yeah. So he appoints a bunch of people to the court. He controls the legislative supermajority because they have single-term term limits in El Salvador. You can only serve one term as president. So he got that changed so that he could run for re-election in 2023, I believe. So they got that done. He ran again. He got re-elected. He's currently in his second term. And one of the things that he campaigned on and that got him elected was he campaigned to make El Salvador safe again. For years, for 20 years, there are two gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, that were both actually started in the United States. Both of these gangs were started in the United States. And we, in the United States, then when we would find members of these gangs during the 90s, the aughts, and the 2010s, we would deport them back to El Salvador. And that's how MS-13 and Barrio 18 got started in El Salvador. Those gangs were started here in the United States by El Salvadorans. And prior to us deporting all of those gang members to El Salvador did not have a gang problem. We exported that to them. Yeah. We exported MS-13 and Barrio 18 to El Salvador. And then both of those gangs grew. MS-13, greater numbers, greater prominence, but to a point where there were 60 or 70,000 members of those gangs just in El Salvador. And those gangs were incredibly violent. As we'll talk about, their weapon of choice was the machete as opposed to firearms. And very quickly, El Salvador achieved the highest homicide rate of any country in the world. It was the murder capital of the world. And something like 70% of the homicides in El Salvador were gang-related. And it wasn't, from what I've read, it wasn't just rival gangs fighting with one another. They would just murder people who were not in either gang for seemingly very, very trivial reasons. And it made it simply untenable to live in El Salvador. And the gangs had taken over to such a point and made the country so incredibly unsafe that it's almost indescribable, some of the shit that I read that these guys did. And I'm not going to recount any of it in graphic detail. But they had, or at least believed that they had, the members of these gangs, especially MS-13, a level of impunity that allowed them or permitted them to just attack citizens, civilians, with machetes for very little reason. If you just looked at somebody sideways accidentally, they'd cut your arms off or they'd cut your head off. And I can't even fathom what it was like to have to try to coexist with that. And, you know, I'm fortunate to have some friends who are El Salvadoran who have come from there. And, you know, hearing some of the stories that I've heard from them, It sounds as though it was legitimately a completely unsafe, untenable environment for normal civilians to just try and live. And there were so many of these gang members as well, and they were literally everywhere. Anyway, so there was an accusation that when President Bukele came in, that he met with the leaders of these two gangs, and he basically worked out a deal, he was accused of paying them money or all kinds of different things so that they would stop killing people, and to bring the homicide rate down. And that he denies that. He's been accused of it. And all of the things that I've read over the last few days, I have not seen any proof that that occurred. But he got elected. Initially, for the first couple of years, there wasn't any dramatic alteration in law enforcement or anything like that. And the homicide rate came down like 60 or 70%, a huge amount. But then, let me see if I can find it here. Okay. So that worked for the first couple of years, if that even happened. Okay. But then beginning on March 25th, 2022, over a weekend, 3 days of gang-related violence left 87 people dead, including several children. In response, President Bukele asked the Salvadoran parliament to ratify a state of emergency, which was that state of exception that I had mentioned earlier, but it functions as a state of emergency. And Parliament did. He also ordered the police and army to initiate mass arrests of those responsible for the violence, and that kind of snowballed on itself. And it was a very short time after that that he gave the orders to build this prison, CECOT, that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. But as a part of this process, his Congress approved reforms necessary to increase the maximum sentence for gang membership from 9 years to 45 years. That's just for gang membership. That's not for conduct. That's a status crime. Your status as a gang member. They passed rules that gave legal coverage to police to arrest any citizen suspected of being a gang member, even if they didn't have any proof, as well as to punish the dissemination of gang messages, including independent journalism that was talking about the gang crisis. So if you were a reporter and you wrote a story about MS-13, you could end up in prison. You could get 15 years in prison for that. So the two gangs, MS, and the MS stands for Mara Salvatrucha, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs were estimated in 2022 to have around 70,000 members in El Salvador, and around 72,000 suspected gang members have been sent to prison in El Salvador, including CECOT. And so a couple other things about El Salvador. Abortion is banned with no exceptions for incest, rape, or threat to the mother's life. And as a result, recently, over 2 decades, over 180 women have been imprisoned for abortion-related crimes, some for up to 30 years. Discrimination against LGBTQ people in El Salvador is very widespread. According to a 2013 survey by Pew Research, 53% of Salvadorans believe that homosexuality should not be accepted by society. And although homosexuality itself is legal, gay marriage is not legally recognized, even though they've tried to pass that with ballot initiatives. Okay, so now that's kind of our backdrop. Let's talk about President Bukele himself. He came in, first assumed office in June of 2019. He'd previously been in advertising, had an advertising business with his father, and they did a lot of politically related advertising contracts and stuff. He was elected mayor of a city called Nuevo Cuscatlan. Then he was elected mayor of San Salvador, which is their capital. He founded the Nuevas Ideas Party in 2019, and that's when he won with 53% of the vote. El Salvador has experienced democratic backsliding under Bukele as he has dismantled democratic institutions, curtailed political and civil liberties, and attacked independent media and his political opposition. Bukele has been described as an authoritarian and an autocrat. And up until recently, it may still be up there, his Twitter bio said something like the world's coolest dictator. He's also very, very well known for essentially functioning as an internet troll, and he just trolls people on the internet. An autocratic ruler of a country, and he's an internet troll. And his bio says world's coolest dictator. So, for whatever that's worth. In February 2020, he ordered 40 soldiers into the Legislative Assembly building to intimidate lawmakers into approving funding for some proposed legislation that he wanted. Interestingly, he describes himself as neither on the political left nor the political right. Which, anytime I hear somebody say that, I think they're just in it for the money, but, let's read on and see what we can find. Again, prior to 1990, El Salvador basically did not have a gang violence problem. Most of El Salvador's violent crimes recently, over the last several years, 25 years, were committed by MS-13 and Barrio 18. Although they are El Salvador's largest gangs, both of them originated in Los Angeles. MS-13 was formed in the 1980s by Salvadoran refugees fleeing their civil war. Barrio 18 was formed in the 1960s by Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles. Much of the gang violence stemmed from income inequality, poverty, poor schools, lack of job opportunities, and high urbanization. It's a very densely populated country. Like geographically, it's very small. And from what I read, it seems like it's in a pretty mountainous region as well. So, on December 8th, 2021, the U.S. Department of the Treasury accused President Bukele's government of secretly negotiating with MS-13 and Barrio 18 to lower the country's homicide rate. The department stated that Bukele's government provided financial incentives to both gangs to ensure that they would reduce the country's homicide rate and would also support his political party, Nuevas Ideas, in the election held earlier that year. He has always denied those accusations and instead attacked the United States and is saying, the United States is demanding absolute submission from El Salvador and its presidency to try to turn the population against the United States. And, very, very Trumpian stuff going on with him. And, I found a very, very long list of things that MS-13 has done in the United States and in El Salvador. And again, it's like, I think all you really need to know is that their preferred weapon is the machete, and anything beyond that is a little bit too graphic. So, shortly after the gang crackdown in mid-2022 began, Bukele called for the construction of a new 20,000 inmate prison. He announced the construction in July 2022 of the 40,000 inmate Terrorism Confinement Center, or CECOT. in Tecoluca, and I did not see where that was located, but it would be one of the world's largest prisons. In February 2023, President Bukele posted a video on Twitter of him and members of his cabinet touring the prison. So they got that thing open, up, and running in like 6 months. And, here in the Bay Area, when we have an earthquake, it takes 25 years to replace a bridge. Just saying. The prison is staffed by 250 police officers and 600 soldiers, and it covers 410 acres. He posted in a Twitter video in February of 23 showing the transfer of the prison's first 2,000 prisoners, and posted a similar video the following months showing 2,000 additional prisoners. By June 11th, 2024, CECOT had at least 14,500 inmates. It's impossible to know whether or not that's accurate. Okay, during the gang crackdown, they've arrested over 72,000 people who were suspected of being gang members, many of whom were given like group trials where they weren't permitted to see the evidence that was against them individually. They weren't allowed to present an individual defense. And then they were sentenced to horrifically long sentences in these prisons. In a country where the president and the vice president and the warden of this prison, the person who runs this prison, regularly say that no one has ever made it out of this prison alive. No one has ever been released. No one has ever completed a sentence in this prison. And the vast majority of people who are in that prison have not even gotten a trial, let alone an actual sentence, so they know the time frame of how much time they have to serve. But again, it's very easy for somebody like me sitting here in the United States in Northern California to talk about things like due process and arraignments and trials and charges and defenses in El Salvador, a country that I've never visited. Again, I have some friends who are from there, and they're like, hey man, El Salvador is safe again. It's like you can walk around and you're safe. And it wasn't that way for 25 years. And so that means a lot to civilians who live there. And, I've got friends up here from El Salvador who still have family in El Salvador. And they're like, our families are safe now, man. So there's that. And that's a real and valid consideration. It's not something that you can just brush aside, and say, well, they don't have due process, so nah. That's not something you can just brush aside. It's not something that they brush aside for their friends and family who still live in El Salvador. And, so obviously now, President Bukele was one of the first people to congratulate Donald Trump after he won re-election in 2024. He came up here and met with Donald Trump in 2019 after he'd been inaugurated, and called on Trump to promote legal migration in an effort to combat illegal migration and to maintain United States temporary protected status for Salvadoran immigrants who are living here in the United States. And I know that recently Donald Trump has terminated temporary protected status for immigrants from Venezuela, immigrants from Haiti. I don't know if he's done that for immigrants from El Salvador. So in 2021, President Biden refused to meet with President Bukele when he arrived unannounced in Washington, D.C. to come meet with Joe Biden. So there's that. But there's been a lot of stuff going on with President Bukele and the Trump administration in Trump's second term. And in February of 2025, a couple months ago, Marco Rubio went down to El Salvador and met with President Bukele. Sorry, I got a bug buzzing me. I have a gnat. And that's where they struck this deal that President Bukele would house deportees from the United States in CECOT prison, regardless of whether or not those people had been convicted of a crime. And I know on the first 3 planes that went down there on March 15th, I believe there were several passengers who were women, and President Bukele sent them back. He's like, we don't have facilities for women here. And nobody really knows where those women ended up or where they landed. We're still trying to find that out. So, but Bukele made that offer of that deal to Rubio. Rubio accepted it. Bukele offered Secretary of State Rubio to accept non-Salvadoran deportees from the United States, including convicted American prisoners, in exchange for money. Prisoners of U.S. citizenship and legal residence. Rubio described the offer as the most unprecedented and extraordinary migratory agreement anywhere in the world. On March 15th, 2025, the United States deported 238 alleged members of Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua to El Salvador, and they all sit in that prison except for one, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who apparently has been moved to a different prison in El Salvador. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia appears to be the very first person to ever be let out of CECOT. First one ever to walk out of there alive. Yeah. So, and there are all kinds of legal things going on with that right now. As far as his personal life goes, he's married. He's got a couple kids. According to the Salvadoran government's transparency website, Bukele's monthly presidential salary is $5,200. That's how much you make per month as president of El Salvador. He has personal wealth of $2.5 million. Most of that was acquired through business ventures before entering politics, and he owns a coffee plantation, a coffee farm. I have another whole section here about MS-13, but I don't really think we need to cover them anymore. So let's talk about this prison. So I kept coming across this number that it's got 14,500 inmates. But digging into, and that's what's reported by the El Salvadoran government. They don't publicly disclose, for the most part, who is confined in CECOT. And there are families in El Salvador who've had relatives who've just disappeared or have been arrested and then disappeared, and they think their family member might be in CECOT, but there's no way for them to confirm that. Because once you are inside CECOT as an inmate, you're not allowed phone calls, you're not allowed internet access, you're not allowed visitors, you're not allowed any contact with the outside world. And the prison is known for alleged human rights abuses, including overcrowding, lack of due process, and inhumane conditions. And amazingly, CECOT does not engage in rehabilitation. No prisoner has ever been confirmed to have been released from the facility prior to Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And authorities have stated that there are no plans to release any prisoners currently serving sentences there ever. Additionally, we don't know exactly what that means for the people who are there who were deported to there by the United States. Again, and 60 Minutes did a thing on these deportees, these prisoners, a couple weeks ago, and they found that 75% of them have no criminal record in the United States or in El Salvador. About 12% of them had a criminal record in the United States for nonviolent offenses like burglary. And there were about 8% that did have criminal charges, at least, and some convictions for violent crimes like rape, murder, kidnapping, assault, things like that. But 8%, man. And 75% of them have no record at all, including Kilmar Abrego Garcia. But the prison itself. So, okay, here we go. Well, and in April 2025, after he met with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, President Bukele said he's going to double CECOT's capacity to 80,000 inmates. So the prison itself, it's guarded by 19 guard towers. There are 2 sets of walls that are 30 feet high, and each wall is 24 inches thick. They're topped with barbed wire. There are 2 sets of electrified fences, and all of the outdoor surfaces are gravel in order to make footsteps audible. So the current prison that holds 40,000 people, it has 256 cells, and each cell can average 156 to 160 inmates in each cell. The cells are equipped with 4-level metal bunk beds. There are no mattresses, there are no sheets, there are no pillows. Each cell has 2 toilets that are obviously just out in the open, and 2 wash basins, meaning large buckets of water. And so there are 2 large buckets of water in each cell, and 160 inmates have to wash their uniforms in that water and have to bathe in that same water in a large bucket. Yeah. The cells are lit by artificial lights 24 hours a day. There are no windows anywhere in these buildings. Each cell is provided with 2 Bibles, and closed-circuit camera TVs and armed guards monitor each cell 24 hours a day. The inmates are permitted to leave their cell for 30 minutes a day. So they're in there for 23 and a half hours a day. No windows, no access to the outside world. The lights are on 24 hours a day. They're allowed to leave their cell to get some exercise. And when they leave their cell to get some exercise, they are all taken into an adjoining hallway, all one cell, so 160 guys. They're taken into an adjoining hallway, which, again, has artificial light, enclosed. It's all concrete. There are no windows. And they're allowed to exercise in that hallway for 30 minutes before going back into the cell. Legally, there is absolutely no way that a prison like this would be permitted to exist in the United States. It would be cruel and unusual punishment. And further, I think, bingo. It's like, I gotta love it when a quote that pops up in my head that's in my stuff, I'm like, I need to put this quote here. And it's right there on the next page. So Donald Trump has said he wants President Bukele to take homegrowns at this prison, and has said multiple times he wants to ship U.S. citizens to this prison, CECOT, in El Salvador. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt has repeated that as well. However, there's a think tank near D.C. called the Cato Institute. Cato Institute immigration expert David Beer, B-I-E-R, stated the following: U.S. citizens may not be deported to or imprisoned abroad. There is no authority like that in any U.S. law. And Donald Trump has said you need to build 5 more CECOTs so that I can send you more. So 200,000 people. Presumably, a lot of those would be United States citizens. But again, I think overall, I hadn't thought about El Salvador or Central America in years. It's just not a region of the world that's on my radar. And then Donald Trump, then Marco Rubio makes this deal to send deportees there with no due process. Fortunately, the Supreme Court has said you can deport people under the Alien Enemies Act, but they still have to get due process. They get notice. They get a time frame. They get a hearing. You have to give them due process. The Supreme Court did not say that Donald Trump must bring back the deportees, the 238 that we've already taken there. But the Supreme Court has upheld the order that says he's got to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. So we'll see if that happens. But, the country of El Salvador had not been on my radar for quite some time until Trump made this deal and had the president of El Salvador in the Oval Office. And we all saw the interaction that they had with each other. And, now the country of El Salvador in this prison, CECOT prison, it's in the spotlight. It's getting a tremendous amount of attention. And, and then Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen went down there and demanded to meet with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And they brought Kilmar Abrego Garcia outside the prison walls, dressed him up in nice clothes, and they met in a hotel restaurant with fake margaritas, apparently. And, so nobody knows how this is going to shake out. Nobody knows how this is going to shake out. But there have been several prominent Democrats, members of the House and the Senate, who have given public statements, not so veiled warnings to President Bukele that Donald Trump is not going to be president forever. Dude's 79 years old, man. He's 79 years old and he is a lame duck. Even if he decides to overstay the end of his second term, he's 79 and he lives on Big Macs and Diet Cokes and cheats at golf and he's morbidly obese. I mean, the man, he's not a healthy man. He's just not. And, semi-veiled threats to President Bukele that's like, you need the United States a lot more than we need you, sport. And sooner or later, there's going to be another Democrat in the Oval Office. And how you are behaving right now is no doubt going to have a significant impact on El Salvador's relationship with the United States going forward when that happens. But, all of this stuff is up in the air right now. All of this stuff with the courts is progressing through court systems, and there are hearings taking place, and the United States Supreme Court is issuing rulings, and we're hanging out to see if Donald Trump is going to comply with any of those. So it's a very, very fluid situation. We have deported additional people to El Salvador, to this prison, after those first 3 flights on March 15th. But and there still continues to be a lack of due process, both here and in El Salvador. But again, the civilian residents of El Salvador are happy that their country is now safe, and they credit President Bukele with making that happen. And it's really hard to fault them for that, especially when we're up here in the United States enjoying all kinds of rights and civil liberties that they don't necessarily have. So that is my episode about El Salvador, President Bukele, MS-13, and CECOT prison. I appreciate you guys listening. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments on this video, wherever you might see it. And I will come back to those. But we still have a lot more to learn about all of this situation. And hopefully we don't start to resemble a country with an autocratic ruler any more than we already do on April 27th, 2025. But I'm not getting my hopes up on that. Thank you for watching and listening, and I'll see you guys soon. Be safe.